If you jump onto the next slide, just a brief overview of where I'm sitting currently, which is the National Cleaner Production Center. It is based in the CSIR, and you can read much faster than I can speak. So I'm sure most of you have already read that sentence. So I'm not going to stand still on that. This is just to give you a bit of a context where I'm currently at. Let's move right into the context. I think what is important for industrial spaces in South Africa, and having listened to already some of the speakers this morning, everyone has a role to play in addressing energy, right? And not all of us can necessarily get involved in, the grid or energy provision or anything like that. So some of us work in peripheral areas, like the previous speaker from the EWCTA, for example, where skills are actually crucial. But a lot of people would argue, well, maybe that's not directly involved. I would argue opposite, but anyway. So industrial spaces are similar, okay? And they operate in the following context, which I've just briefly outlined here, okay? Industry, in fact, humanity is faced by a number of what some people refer to grand challenges, but also, fairly large activities or actions or interventions that are currently taking place. And I'm not going to expand all of these. There's really no time. But simply put, the planet Earth is a limited resource. Okay? Maybe I should say that again, right? Because when you talk about solar energy, that's unlimited as long as the sun shines. Okay? And having an interest in astronomy, it's projected that the sun will shine for another 4 billion odd years. So I think that's kind of long enough, right? But for the planet, we have a completely different challenge, okay? In fact, a number of the minerals that are being mined, the known deposits will end in the next 10 or 20 years. So what do we do then? Okay, so dwindling resources, limited resources is part of our life, okay? And we have to start thinking differently about how to work with this, okay? Then, of course, circular economy, climate change, emissions reduction, big thing. The presence of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone above 400 ppms, okay? I think in 2017 already, if I remember correctly. So obviously, emissions become important. Okay, why is that important? Well, if you look at the greenhouse effect and the amount of CO2 and methane and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that leads to a greenhouse effect. And I'm not going to talk about that, but this is the context that you're operating in, okay? Huge biodiversity loss. If you go to the IUCN website, for example, you see there's a red list of 1 million plus species that are endangered, for example. It has already been mentioned the just transition and the just energy transition, specifically to energy, are crucial. The current geopolitical landscape in which we find ourselves, okay, where there are different groupings, and again, I'm not a politician, but these things do have an impact, okay, and it has an impact on economics, it has an impact on value chains, on supply chains, on logistics flows, all these kinds of things, and where do you get resources and materials from, and how do you manage that, okay, and then, of course, systems change. I think humanity as a whole, not just South Africa, not just certain countries in the world. If you look at every single country in the world, there are a huge number of drivers driving change. Okay, and I think we are on the cusp of a massive system change in terms of how humanity functions. And that, of course, impacts industrial spaces. Okay, right, let's move on. So that's just for context. So in South Africa, there's an estimated plus minus 400 industrial parks or industrial spaces in the country. That includes 15 special economic zones. Both of these are key focus of the dtic and national government. They are seen as catalysts for socio-economic growth. They are a crucial contributor to local economic development. So municipalities actually, if they could really include a lot more active interventions that relate to industrial spaces or industrial parks in some cases specifically, then that could really contribute to the local economic development. Okay, so it's important to understand that we are part of a system. Okay, so when you talk about energy, industrial spaces form part of a system, not just to provide energy, but also in terms of energy consumption, and then also housing industries that can play a role in the national energy landscape, right? So it is important to understand the multiple levels at which one can look at the relevance of industrial spaces to the energy landscape. Industry, of course, is a key contributor to economic strength, despite the fact that South Africa's industry has been shrinking over consecutive years now for quite some time. Any country without a good, at least manufacturing industry, will really struggle in terms of its growth plans. Okay, it is one of the fundamentals that is required. Then, just briefly, I want to just touch on our national government priorities behind this, so that you understand that there is a driver at national level, but also at provincial level, that includes industrial spaces, and also, of course, the green economy, or the circular economy, as some people refer to it. Okay, right, let's move on. So this is just context, just to give you an idea of what influences industrial spaces. If we then look at the current focus areas in terms of activities regarding industrial spaces and energy, okay, we are working, not just NCPC, but dtic, National Treasury, a number of other organizations, including the CSIR Energy Center, SANEDI, and a whole bunch of others who have also presented here. I see Eskom is here as well. I mean, Eskom is involved in some areas. So in a lot of industrial areas, there is quite a bit of work currently being done, trying to address the grid and the electricity generation constraints. Okay, very often we don't hear about this, so people assume that nothing is happening. Maybe coming back to a comment that Jansi said earlier, you know, a lot of these things are happening behind the scene and you don't know it. Okay, so I can assure you there's quite a body of work happening behind the scenes in a number of industrial spaces across the country in terms of supply, security of supply, the quality of power that industry gets, and so on. Okay, a big challenge, and that was mentioned earlier as well, is that there is quite a bit of cable theft present. And also some vandalism in some cases. So how do you counter that? Okay, so industrial areas across the country have to address these kinds of issues, obviously together and in tandem with the local municipality and other role players. Okay. We're also looking at supporting continued business operation and the retention of jobs, which is a big focus by DTIC. And therefore, the eco-industrial park approach is really critical in that, because it provides you a neutral platform that enables you to look at the different drivers of sustainability. Okay, so looking at environment, the social side, the economic side, but then also from an operations and administrative management and governance perspective. Okay, so an eco-industrial park approach really helps you to address especially, business operation from that angle, but of course also the other aspects as I just mentioned. Then there's quite a bit of, I don't know how to put it nicely. I think a number of people are really worried about the impact of CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the EU. This is not only something that's coming currently from the EU, it's also coming from other countries. The US is currently working on that. Australia, New Zealand, Japan are looking at this. There are a number of countries in the world that are introducing mechanisms to measure the impacts of carbon in producing a certain product, okay, and to limit imports of products that have excessive carbon exposure, okay, if I can put it like that, right? So again, that whole topic can probably take a whole session of an hour or two all by its own, okay? But this is important for any kind of industry in South Africa that wants to export to any of South Africa's main trading partners. Okay, so this is again critical when you look at decarbonization, of course, when you look at renewable energy introduction, and when one starts having conversations about an energy mix and all these nice things, that people get very excited about, but industry has to comply with these requirements, otherwise they're not able to export. Okay, right. Then of course there's quite a bit of work both from the eco-industrial park perspective, but also NCPC and a range of other players looking at supporting and improving competitiveness. We work, for example, very closely with Productivity SA. We also look at Proudly South African and a number of other such entities. Okay, so competitiveness, of course, is a big focus area. There's a large focus for me specifically on fostering collaboration between industry, municipalities, and academia and government. Okay, so some people call it the quadruple helix as well, where you include civil society as well. very, very important. If you look globally at the competitiveness of industrial spaces, those that do really well always have a strong link to the RDI sector. I assume everybody knows what RDI is, but research, development, and innovation. Okay. So it is important that we foster these relationships. And I did see some questions earlier on one of the earlier presentations, how can academia get involved, in doing some of that research? Those are great questions to see popping up, because if there's interest from academia, and I know, there's a lot of pressure in the academic sector, on trying to push through students and certain performance measurements that are put forward by the Department of Higher Education, for example. But you still need to relate back to industry. Okay, and that link has been broken in many cases. Okay, and it's actually quite important that you try and foster that a lot more. Okay, and then lastly, again, a focus area, of course, is the circular economy and the just transition, as Janci said earlier. That includes sustainability and the NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions of South Africa towards the Paris Agreement, which addresses climate change, so global warming, the 1.5 degrees that everybody's talking about, but also emissions. Okay, industry has to contribute. Okay, if a country like South Africa or any country in the world says, listen, we have nationally determined contributions, or we have certain targets on the SDGs, who does that? I mean, surely it's not just up to government. Okay, it's industry, it's business, it's civil society, it's every one of us that have to do certain things, right? So obviously in industrial space, we look at that as well. Right, next slide. So okay, good, thank you. So if we talk about the just transition, I think this is important to stand still on, because this is where one of the touch points are with industry. A lot of people talk about this. Industry generally is focused on turnover, production, order books, cash flow, these kinds of things, depending on the size of the industry and the kind of products that are being produced. Okay, so a lot of them often do not participate in the conversation around just transition because they just can't, or at the time that they are available, others are not available. Okay, so this is still a challenge, not just in South Africa, it's globally a problem. Okay, but industry needs to be a core player in the just transition, and specifically in our context today, the just energy transition. Okay, so while South Africa has done some great preparatory work, we seem to be struggling a bit in implementing that at an industry level. Okay, a lot's been done in the mining environment, for example, but again, industry per se, so manufacturing primarily, not much involvement in this. Okay, yet there is a large potential in that space to actually have significant impact. Okay. And then, of course, related to that is, at the same time, one needs to address, the key focus areas of national government, which looks at poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Okay. So if you talk about a just energy transition, the justness is very often raised. Okay. And the justness very often speaks to these kinds of aspects. Okay. But it's much broader. And again, I don't have time to go into all the detail. Okay. So decarbonization, again, critical for industry, in line with CBAM, for example, and the requirements of a number of our trading partners, but also in terms of climate change. Okay. In terms of emissions reductions, the NDCs of South Africa, we have to look at decarbonization. Okay. Not always that easy, but it has to be on the agenda. Okay, partnerships are crucial in achieving this. If there's any lesson that I can share with anyone who wants to really, drive things forward, it is all about working together and fostering partnerships. Nothing can happen without humans working together. Okay, it's not organizations. If there are no people in an organization, that organization can do nothing. Okay. And I know some of you are tongue-in-cheek thinking about AI, and maybe, an artificial organization can do this, but you still need humans to be involved, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. And so it needs to be about people at all levels. Okay. So partnerships and collaboration is really important. At an industry level, I think the just transition very often looks at new solutions that include smart metering. If you look at our city of Cape Town, for example, is managing its grid compared to some of the other metros, made some great progress going forward. Okay. but everybody's looking at this, and I think that should be an integral part. So if you look at how, from an industrial park or an industrial space perspective, there can be an impact, this is definitely one of those. Okay. Then, of course, looking at small scale embedded generation, smart grids, microgrids, those kinds of things, and many people, installing, renewable energy and so on, which can feed into their energy consumption, but only at a small scale. Right, let's move on. I'm not far from the end. So the current NCPC actions, just for interest. So we've done some energy planning for a number of industrial spaces, especially from an eco-industrial park perspective, because that's part of the output. So looking at, we have done this for East London Industrial Development Zone, which is a special economic zone. Put at the Taba Industrial Park, eco-industrial, and we're currently working on Roslyn outside Pretoria. We will also do this for a number of others that are on the Global Eco-Industrial Parks program. We provide assistance to East London, for example, specifically. Why? Because they're part of the Eco-Industrial Parks program on implementing renewable energy solutions. I'm sure you can appreciate the fact that it's not possible for us to be everywhere and help everyone. That's just simply not possible. So we have to work with those industrial spaces that are part of our program. I'm already touched on collaboration. I'm not going to touch on it again. I think collaboration is massive. Okay. Then we do energy efficiency assessments and supporting, implementation of solutions through NCPC, where we also work with Sanedi and NBI and a whole range of other players. And the GIPP, that stands for the Global Eco-Industrial Parks program. That's our flagship program. That's through another mechanism through which we do this. And then, of course, also energy planning and management guides and other such tools as part of a greater toolbox for eco-industrial parks. So watch this space. We will launch a online portal where you can access all kinds of tools and templates and case studies from an EIP perspective in the next 2 or 3 months, where you can find this information, to actually help you in your planning. Right, can we move on, please? We're almost done. Next steps. This is critical. Okay, so from our perspective in industrial spaces, what is needed to, really scale out the impact of energy and the overlap with industry. I mean, industry, of course, as you can understand, is not only looking at energy, they're also looking at water, they're also looking at waste and resource usage and other aspects. But from an energy perspective, I think it's critical to look at scaling out existing activities. So looking at energy efficiency, introducing renewable energy, looking at power quality interventions. This is crucial. The more supply sources you have onto the grid, power quality becomes an issue. So that has to be addressed. Again, I'm mentioning RDI. I've already touched on it, but this is really important for us to scale out. So there's a range of research areas that one can engage in. Unfortunately, I don't have money to give to anyone to do that. But there are funds available, and I know through DSI, Department of Science and Innovation, and in connection with the CSIR and others, there is funding available for different areas of research and doing studies and surveys and so on. But I think this is critical for industry. Okay. Then, of course, the regulatory aspect. There already are things like extended producer responsibility, energy performance certificates, the relevance of the NDCs and SDGs in terms of company reporting and those kinds of things. And energy is a core part of that. Okay. So again, how does industry contribute? Well, let's start with the reporting, and then from the reporting, identify where the shortcomings are, and then start implementing those kinds of things. Okay. I think awareness raising is critical. We are not doing enough on this in South Africa and in fact globally. Okay. But I mean, seeing as we're talking about South African energy today, that's something I want to raise. Then a lot of people talk about coordination, but I don't think the penny has dropped yet. Okay. Sorry, I'm being blunt. But it is really important to understand this. If you want to coordinate something, it means you have to work together, regardless of whether you like a person or not, number one. Okay. Number two, you need to coordinate so that you don't duplicate the limited resources we have as a comparatively small country in the world. Okay. We cannot afford to do competing efforts or redo something that somebody else has already done. Okay. So coordination is critical. Okay. How do we do that? Okay. How do we plan for that? How do we monitor and measure that? This is really important. And then, of course, implementation. Right. Last slide. Let's just move on. I think there's one more thought. Yeah. Okay, so I want to leave you with this. So if you look from an industry perspective, and not just in terms of energy, there are all these things that impact industry. And I said industry can from two levels. So industry can make a difference, okay, but it's also that industry can, okay, if you get what I'm saying, right? So the question is, with all these impacts, how can we change our approach and our thinking? Because we can no longer continue doing the same thing, okay? And this applies to energy in South Africa as well, all right? And then if you go on to the last slide, if we do this wrong, that's what we end up with. Okay. So when we talk about energy, I would encourage everyone, to consider all the different aspects, okay, as far as you can. And remember that we're working with a system. And we don't want to end up with an industry can that no longer can. Thank you very much, Yancy.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much, Bernd. That was fascinating. There are a lot of issues that we could discuss further and that I would like to know about. Just want to ask you, you're okay with us placing your presentation on the website?
Yes, absolutely, no problem.
Okay, fantastic. In general, everyone, the presentations will be available on the website, so please have a look. If they go too fast, make sure that you do visit them on the website. I'm sorry, we have to move right along. Our next panel is on meeting energy demand at local government level. And our first speaker there is Mr. Adrian Stone, Manager for Data Management and Integration Platforms, Sustainable Energy Markets at the City of Cape Town Energy Directorate. Mr. Stone, I think we must go straight into your presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Hi, Yancy. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you clearly.
And can you see my slides?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll try and stick to my 15 minutes. And I'll just set a little timer to do that. So my name's Adrian Stone. I'm the manager of a branch called Data Management and Integration Platforms, and that's part of the Sustainable Energy Markets Department. And we're in the Energy Directorate, and we're not the electricity utility. We're a much smaller entity in the Energy Directorate. There are two entities in there, and I like to think of us as the wart on the warthog. So we support the energy directly, particularly around sustainability and lately on load shedding. So load shedding's really, along with, there are always benefits to crises, and one of them is it's drawn these two departments much closer together. So why did I call or have the words event horizon in my title? Well, if you really want to feel small, then go and read about event horizons on the internet. But I think what we can all understand is it's a point of no return. And I see Dr. Muladzi is going to talk on the municipal financial model later, and I hope to sort of set him up a bit and provide an introduction with my presentation. But in terms of the municipal financial model and what load shedding is doing to it, it's bringing us to that point of no return. So that's the theme of my presentation. So over the last few years, I've been involved at a local or municipal level with the problem of load shedding. I've come up with this law, which I call Statler's Law, which is basically that optimism about restoring reliable supply is inversely proportional to current load shedding, and it has no correlation with seniority and experience. I've seen very senior colleagues over the last 2 years completely go from one extreme to the other in terms of their views of what we should do, how we should respond, what risks we should take. And when load shedding is bad, we're prepared to take a lot of risk. And when it clears up, like it is now, then all of a sudden we're very aware of risk and things move more slowly. So it's a very difficult problem to deal with because our perception of it is constantly changing, no matter how experienced we are and how much we know about the industry. Municipal revenue from electricity sales is kind of key to this, this idea of the event horizon. So our finance manager likes to talk about the golden goose, and for many years it has been the golden goose of municipal finance. And it is in the process of becoming a bit of a dead duck, hopefully not permanently. There are reasons why demand would increase again. Bernd spoke about decarbonization. There are a lot of drivers of increasing electricity demand there, other than the reducing factor of small-scale embedded generation. But for the last more than 10, 15 years, we've seen a solid decline in sales. And we see a decline in the electricity intensity of the economy. So the amount of electricity going to units of GDP's drops, going up to 1.8% then. What does load shedding do to that? Well, last year it took away 15% of sales. I think it's well known that Cape Town does have some generation assets, specifically a pump storage station called Steenbras. And the sort of green share is what we managed to mitigate. So it's significant, but we still severely impacted by load shedding, and that sales problem just became a whole lot worse. So for now, electricity remains a subsidizing part of the city. That graph on the right is sort of area graph of sources of revenue for the city, and the light blue is electricity. So it is much larger than things like even property rates. And certainly a lot larger than what we get for water and waste management. So the way that we charge it is we carve it out as something called an unregulated portion, which means that we're asking NERSA not to exercise approval over it. So it's not part of the tariff approval. It seems to have been working so far. But yeah, if you multiply that 37 odd cents by 8 million kilowatt hours sold, you get 3 billion rand per annum. Up till now, if we don't make that target, they still make us pay. So that cuts into our capital reserves. But we have managed to convince corporate to gradually reduce this by 0.5% per annum. You can see our sales are actually going down by almost 1.8%. So that's insufficient. And yeah, there you can see there are big numbers in a municipal budget, and electricity is the biggest revenue at 19 billion. But of that, in this current budget, but of that we expect to pass 14 billion straight to Eskom. So if most of that 19 billion is the 14 billion from Eskom, and then our network costs, that's 2.7% of local GDP. So that's a huge amount that gets paid by our customers as an input to the economy, and then we're not really delivering reliable electricity. So that is going to cause problems. What happens? Well, people invest in their own generation, and you can see here how these are just the legal applications have just skyrocketed. And towards the end of last year, we just ran off our feet, and we can't process this many applications. We're just not set up for it. So we're frantically trying to develop an online system to try and streamline this. So we've got colleagues working very, very hard. But we peaked at 1,500 applications in a month. And you can sort of see fully in that exponential growth. If we include the illegal, we're quite lucky in Cape Town. We've got about a 50% compliance rate, which is quite good. And most of the commercial is registered. And we've probably got up to about 300 MVA, I estimated there. So most of that capacity is commercial, but you can see the real growth in the number of installations on the right is residential. It's growing exponentially at an accelerated rate. And that's really moving things along faster than we can handle. I mean, just to sum up the problem. So how are we responding? we've got a very strong political commitment in Cape Town. So the current administration, it's a sort of flagship project, and there are 4 aspects to this. The creation of an energy strategy. The City of Cape Town likes its strategies, and so we've put in a lot of effort into an energy strategy. And obviously the program of interest here is this load shedding mitigation project, but we also need to reform the power utility. And the words we've used are to make it future fit and financially resilient. It speaks to the problem I explained. And then that work package 4 is streamlining this, not just SSCG streamlining, but also the way that we pay for it, and the way that we try and get more exports onto the grid and stimulates more exporting customers, not all, or the minority actually of SEG, especially residential customers, export. And we get a lot of exports on Sundays and Saturdays, which is also difficult to handle. So there you can see the energy strategy, and it's interesting that right at the top there, without going into any of this, that the vision is firmly energy security. And you see carbon neutrality there, obviously also prioritized as one of the principles. And then this commitment of harnessing new energy supply, and that's controversial, and I'll touch on that briefly before I end. It's been a long time since a municipal utility expanded its generation assets, and it hasn't been done under this version of the Electricity Regulation Act, although in theory it's possible. So, and this is the sort of key issue, is this aspect of the load shedding mitigation program that wants to increase the availability of specifically dispatchable energy. So that's energy that the system operator, or network controller, as they're now called, can dispatch in response to load shedding. So we dispatch Steenbras, but after a few days of stage 6, the bottom dam's full, or we can't empty out the top dam anymore, right? So we're limited by how much we can pump in response to ongoing load shedding, and that generally means thermal power, or potentially PV with battery storage. Steenbras is also very old, it's 40 years old. It needs R1 billion to get it back on its feet. It's got all sorts of structural problems that were actually there from the beginning. And then also another goal is to increase installed capacity more generally over time. And there's an embedded IPP program that's actually being evaluated at the moment. So hopefully an award will take place within the coming months. And then also we're about to break ground in Atlantis on our own 7 megawatt solar plant, so much more modest capacity, but we hope to build more in Potterflay, which is in the sort of southeast of the city, and the grid is very strong there, so we can evacuate an entire network. Then there's a demand-side response program. All I'll say on that is that's much more difficult than we thought. It's a tricky thing to do. So yeah, we've sort of embarked on a tender there, and yeah, really working hard to try and close it there, but a lot of risks for the service provider. Then I think interestingly, we've done quite a bit of expansion planning studies, some modeling studies of supply and demand. It's very similar to an IRP. The CSIR did 2 of those. And that purple there you can see is dispatchable generation. So that's thermal generation like Ankara, very expensive in summer there. And then there's another one being funded by SAEP, where we've actually got all the Eskom plants in there to sort of model load shedding from the bottom up. I'll just briefly touch on power utility reform, just because there was the market model presentation on Friday, which some of you might have gone to. And it's something our network control, which is positioning itself to become a distribution system operator. So in other words, a system operator at a local level that dispatches distributed energy resources, like large PV plants and batteries. And also kind of wants to also work with a distribution market operator. And we didn't see that in the market model currently. And a lot of questions came up about that at last week's forum. So yeah, that really needs to happen for us to be able to respond to many of these problems. So I'm going to touch on, just maybe briefly to finish off, I've got 2 minutes left. It's just some of the insights from these studies, which I think are quite interesting. And just the first problem is you have to hold assets in reserve, so in order to respond to load shedding. So whether it's PV with batteries or dispatchable power, you can't run it. You've got to wait until there's load shedding, and that creates all sorts of regulatory problems and cost problems. And fuel is very volatile, but I'm maybe going to just go to this very last slide. And so we don't know how we get this past the regulator, but I think it's, traditionally the regulator would look at what we're buying and saying, well, is it cost rational? Is it lower than Eskom Megaflex? I don't think that's applicable here. It's not the right benchmark for a load shedding mitigation capacity, because it's effectively like having a diesel backup for a hospital. Eskom can't supply by definition, so they shouldn't be the benchmark. It's more the cost of backup for our customers. And of course, if we are running backup at a much higher capacity factor, that's a lot cheaper. So I worked out that it reduces levelized costs by about 30% in severe load shedding. So, and that overcomes that difference in losses. So I think there's a strong regulatory argument, but we don't know whether it would be heard, and it's a major risk for us responding. And so I'm going to finish off in the last 30 seconds just with what I thought might be needed from the scientific and research community. If I kind of read the purpose of this forum or one of its potential spin-offs correctly, I think we lack methodologies for electricity system planning at a local and regional level. We've learned a lot. We know that we need to start with the hosting capacity of the major nodes on our network. And we know that network planning and expansion planning need to be very integrated. So there's the alarm. I'm just going to finish off in the last 10 seconds. But there's no blueprint. I think a lot of these methodologies, like the IRP methodology, are quite dated now. I think the measures to ensure electricity resilience at load centers, it's not just technical, but also legal and regulatory. And I think that's a good area for academic research. And this test of both technical and legal studies to support the regulator. I don't think the regulator's got a lot to draw from here. They're very much on their own, and I really sympathize with their vulnerable position in making these difficult tariff decisions. So I think, the research community can really support themselves around two issues, like, is it viable or supportable for municipal utilities to mitigate load shedding because there are centers for the economy, and pass the costs on in the tariff? And then how much should go to the tariff? And then also this issue of fixed costs, like how much can fixed costs go up? That's a major fight in the industry. So I'm going to end it there, and thanks very much.